Good morning, good morning. Good morning. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here for the summer lecture series. I want to this is planned by the Education Committee, and I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. Want to let you know about another committee in our Church and Society Committee that works to help us understand and learn about our social principles, which we have new social principles since the last general conference. Not really new, but simpler and better organized social principles. This Church and Society Committee is also committed to interacting in a Christ-like manner with our elected officials and other leaders, sending notes of encouragement and suggestions. And so the postcard party social is Monday night, Monday night the 21st from 6 to 8 here in the Parish Hall. If you were on Church and Society, would you just stand? So Sally Leiter standing up, Mary Ellis Richardson, Suzanne Freeman, Crystal. I know you know. I know. Are there others? Crystal Cranfield is here. Sorry, my brain is stopped. A lovely group that cares a lot about a lot of the things that were addressed in our call to worship this morning, just as we all are. So that's for that committee. I hope you'll put it on your calendar. I want to introduce Sarah Elliott, who is chair of the Education Committee. If you're on the Education Committee, would you please stand? We have Jean Gallion, and there are others. Lee Workman, and there are others. Lee Workman and Sylvia. Why am I having trouble with that? Sylvia Davis. Thank you, Sylvia Davis. Sylvia Wayne. Pauline Schneider, and there are a few others. Anyway, Sarah, why don't you come introduce our speaker?
Thank you all for coming. Our speaker this summer is Dr. Jason Mead. He and his wife Keely and his daughter Dee Dee are regular attendees of our church. His daughter even sings in the church, the children's choir. Dr. Mead teaches history at Johnson University. He's been there going on 19 years now. He says he feels a unity of purpose to be around history professors who are also committed to the extension of God's kingdom at Johnson University. He has an extensive education background in history, where he attended his undergrad at Milligan. He earned a Master's of Divinity at Emmanuel Christian in church history, his Master's in history at UT, and a PhD at the University of Exeter. So he's probably been in school longer than me. So the next couple of weeks, he will be guiding us through the growth of the American church before the Civil War. Please welcome Dr. Jason Mead.
Thank you all, and I thank the Education Committee for the invitation, and Reverend Catherine and Reverend Tim for talking with me and helping pick out this topic. My older kids, we have 2 adult children that are out of the home, and then yet Dee Dee, who's 10. That was poor planning, the spacing of all of that. But the adult children would laugh and ask me what grade I was in. And when I hit the 20s is when it got depressing, when I started doing the accounting for things. Before we kind of dive in, I want to say kind of 3 things by way of apologies, or 1 apology and then 2 things to just keep in mind as we go through. The apology is, I am famous for tangents. Going down rabbit holes, and a thought will occur to me, and I'll digress and go off. My students just know that's what Professor Mead's classes are going to be like. I'm going to try my best not to do that because of the time frame. Each of the numbers on this very broad outline that I put on the handout would be a whole week's worth of material for my Religion in America class. So trying to squeeze it into about 40 minutes. So that's the apology. And then the 2 things to keep in mind. First off, the territory that becomes the United States was not empty. When I grew up, it was kind of presented that way, right? I mean, we knew there were Indians. We got Thanksgiving and Squanto and all of those kinds of things, but all of the history was presented as if this land was basically empty. It was not. There were millions of people organized in different kinds of states, but still, this was a couple of continents full of civilizations and languages and peoples and already ways of doing life that were then in contest with the arrival of European settlers. Right? So anything that we talk about is not going on in a vacuum. The English are having to compete with land and resources against the different Indian groups and nations that lived where they're going to come. And for a long time, the Indians remained the dominant presence in these areas. Right? So just because they arrive in Virginia, the first successful English settlements in the mainland that we're going to talk about here in a second, doesn't mean that the Indians disappeared. Right? Virginia was a terrible place to live for a long time. And it's just, so I want us to kind of keep that in mind, that they're still there. This is still contested land for centuries in some places before the English, the white Americans, become the dominant people in these places. Second, I also want to emphasize the diversity that actually exists. Something else that kind of was presented to me was the thought that, oh, these are all English-speaking people, so they're all kind of the same. And they're all white folk, right? Except for the growing number of African slaves, which was often kind of downplayed in my early education. The people at the time would not have thought of things that way. The Irish, not considered white people until after the Civil War, right? So the whole concept of whiteness and what was considered English was very narrow. So when you have Irish settlers and Scottish settlers and Scots-Irish settlers, they're all different, and don't accuse one of being the other or you'll get yelled at, right? There's Welsh immigrants, Protestants from France, Catholics from France, settlers that come from Germany and various other places of the Holy Roman Empire. None of them would have felt any kind of unity between themselves. They would have all seen themselves as being very different, racially, ethnically, religiously, and also in competition with each other. Right? So the people at the time here in the 1600s and 1700s would have seen it as being a very diverse place. The kind of unity that we want to project onto the past is a product, in many ways, of the 20th century and sometimes the war against communism. We look back and go, oh, these are all Protestants. They're all like us. No, they hated each other, right? As we'll see when we kind of talk through some things. All right, so first off, there's also other Europeans that are in the territory that's going to become the United States. Right? The Spanish especially had a massive presence in Florida and throughout then what becomes the American Southwest, right? And so this map shows a lot of the forts and religious centers for the Spanish, but also some of the presence for the French. Just as another reminder that even as these places became part of the United States, those descendants of Spanish settlers didn't disappear either. Right? They're incorporated into, and they continue their language and religious traditions. So there's areas that are going to include more Roman Catholics, but it's not just the Spanish and the French. Did you know that Sweden had a colony? What is now New Jersey, a big chunk of New Jersey, was originally part of New Sweden. I didn't know that until grad school. That was never covered. I'm like, I just picture the Swedes do it. I don't know. I honestly don't know what the stereotypes. I picture someone 6'5", blonde, skiing. Right? That's sort of what I imagine. I don't imagine them sailing over to establish a colony, but yet there they were. The Dutch I knew about because New York was originally New Amsterdam, and so they've got settlements up the Hudson River. until the English conquered them. But one reason we don't think much about the Swedes is because they were conquered by the Dutch first. So they were only there for a couple of decades before that part was added to the New Netherlands colony. But so you've got even different European groups that are establishing colonies in what's going to become the United States, and those descendants remained and become incorporated into and carry some of those traditions with them. I'm a fan of Julian Fellows and the Downton Abbey, and anyone watch Gilded Age, the new one? Like, okay, some of those families, right, the upper class families in New York City trace their roots back to the Dutch descendants. They're the best money, right? So even after, right, in the 1890s, there's still some value in having those connections to those old Dutch relatives, right? So there's a lot more diversity here, I think, than at least I got in my initial portrayals of things. So I always like to kind of emphasize that at the beginning. Now, the first successful English settlement in the Americas was Jamestown. You see, right, this map shows all of the different Indian nations. Many of them were part of the Powhatan Alliance, so they would have been sort of unified together. But look, they're little Jamestown, surrounded by thousands of Indians. Now, the first set of quotes that I gave you on that handout is from the Virginia Charter, which was written in 1606. It's signed by King James himself of the King James Bible, right? Same King James. Now, language from the 1600s is terrible to try to read and figure out. They never say with 2 words what they could say with 20. But there's a little part, I've given you something from Article 1 and something from Article 3. And so I just want to point out a couple of things. At the very end of that section of Article 1, they're going to call the colony Virginia and other parts and territories in America, either appertaining unto us, right, there's that, what does this mean? Lawyers. There's got to be lawyers in the room. You can explain that later. But here's the key part. Which are not now actually possessed by any Christian prince or people. They recognize that there are other people here. They just don't count. According to the European Christian theology of the time, you can do anything to non-Christians. It's almost like the kill them all and let God sort them out attitude. Sadly, I've seen that on like some t-shirts in the modern age with our wars in Pakistan and Iraq. I've seen t-shirts like that at flea markets and things, kill them all and let God sort them out. It didn't matter. The Indians aren't Christian. You don't have to behave in a civilized manner with them because they're savages. It's a justification for taking the land. It's the same justification that gets used for slavery then. Right? These people in Africa, they're not Christians. They can be enslaved. Now later on down the road, that causes problems when people like early Methodist ministers and Quaker ministers want to preach to the enslaved people. The enslavers start, well, wait a minute. If they get baptized and become a Christian, I can't own them as a slave anymore. So they would actually refuse to allow missionaries to come preach to their slaves because that would mean they couldn't hold them as slaves anymore once they became Christian. Eventually they got over that. The church figures said, no, it's baptism doesn't disqualify you from slavery. So it's like, oh, okay, great. We can preach to them that. But you can see a little bit then right there of the justification for why they could come and take this land. And then in the middle of Article 3, we see one of the stated goals of the colony of Virginia in propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. So one of the stated goals of the colony of Virginia was to be a missionary, to these people here in the Americas, all of those tribes, they're on that map, that don't know anything about Jesus. So you might expect then, if that was one of their primary goals, that would be one of the main things that they did, was try and be a missionary to these Indians. You may be surprised to find out that that's not at all what they did. Right? There is very little missionary effort in the colony of Virginia to reach out to any of these local people. Partially that's because just of how difficult things were in Virginia, right? So it's 1607 that Jamestown is founded, and for years they had no more than a few hundred people. Winters were especially bad. Partially that's because of the makeup of the group that first came over. Many of the first group were young men, nobility, lesser nobles, right? So the third or fourth or fifth sons of people back in England that aren't going to get any inheritance. So what are they going to do? Well, why not come to Virginia, where apparently there's gold nuggets just lying on the beach that you could walk around and pick up. You make your fortune, you bring it back, and you buy some abandoned castle and lands back in England and become an earl that way. They get to Virginia, there's no gold nuggets. There's just starvation. Right? In the second winter there, the winter of 1609 to 1610, there were around 500 colonists. 60 survived the winter. Some of those 60 only survived because they resorted to, brace yourself, cannibalism. That was rumored at the time. There were hints and letters and people's journals. No one came right out and said it by name. If you go visit the historic site, the National Park at Jamestown now, there's a whole exhibit on how they determined that, yes, in fact, cannibalism took place. Those 60 that survived were all ready to go home. The only thing that kept most of them from going back home is the first ships that arrived that spring brought new people and new supplies. But it took them a long time to figure out how to do things, and because there's not gold lying on the beach, who knows what Virginia eventually discovered that would keep this colony alive? What's going to make them money? Tobacco, right? So you can see John Rolfe's plantation, like on that map, right, where it's located. John Rolfe, who will eventually marry Pocahontas, right? It's not Captain John Smith, it's John Rolfe. He developed the version of tobacco that would become popular, become the cash crop. Now, what is the church doing? Struggling with all of this. The Church of England is the established church in Virginia. Right? No one thought otherwise. This is how things were, right? Every state in Europe had an established church. It was either going to be the Roman Catholic Church, or it was going to be some version of a Protestant church. Right? So in some parts of Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, in parts of Scandinavia, it's going to be the Lutheran Church. In some other parts of the Holy Roman Empire, it's going to be the Reformed Church, descended from the ideas of John Calvin and another fun guy with the name Ulrich Zwingli. And then you've got the Church of England, which was, sort of Protestant. Right? You all know how that got started. Henry VIII actually wrote some stuff against Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, was awarded a new title by the Pope, Defender of the Faith, a title that is still used by English monarchs to this day. But he wanted the divorce. He felt a lot of pressure to preserve the family line because his father had emerged out of the War of the Roses, an English civil war that almost tore the nation apart and decades of strife and death. And so you got to have a son. His first wife, Catherine, didn't have a living son. The Pope refused to grant a divorce, and then some of Henry's ministers said, if we created a state church that you were the head of, you could ask Parliament for a divorce and get a divorce that way. So Henry's like, yeah, great. So that's what they did. There weren't a whole lot of changes theologically made between the original Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. It was just a political break. Now, over time, there'd be some more changes, but so we've got the Church of England, so it makes sense that Virginia is going to have an established church. Because that's just how things were done. But the church in Virginia faced greater struggles than the Church of England back in England. For one thing, the parishes. The parish is the amount of land that a minister was assigned to, right? So you've got your church, and the neighborhood, the town, the village surrounding that church was your parish. In England, these are very small. Sunday afternoon, a minister could very easily walk around his parish, visiting the shut-ins, visiting anyone that didn't show up, right? Maybe a prominent person that didn't show up for church that day, you could go visit, right? Very small. In Virginia, the parishes are massive. Hundreds of miles. There's no roads that get to anywhere. People are traveling by boat, right? So there's no easy way for ministers to kind of serve a small parish. Everyone is separated out so far because it's all about growing tobacco. So that means you've got to have farms, you've got to have access to the rivers, so everything is very spread out. There's also the problem with the vestry. The vestry is the local group that controls the purse strings for the church. Now, it makes sense to do that in Virginia because England is, with good weather, 3 to 4 months away. That's a long time for a paycheck to arrive, right? So officials of the Church of England back in England just said, you all take care of the minister's salary locally. Well, you all know how we don't always like to spend things. Church budget, is this necessary? What happens if you don't like the minister? Or you don't like their last sermon when they criticize gambling, Saturday nights, horse racing in town? Or maybe people shouldn't be growing so much tobacco. Then you just don't pay the minister.
Yeah.
So, the local vestries have a lot of power. It also didn't help that the Church of England is not always sending their best and brightest to Virginia. In fact, there were numerous people that had the choice. You can go to jail in England, or you can go and be a minister in Virginia. Some of them chose jail. There was one minister there in Virginia that was famous because he was always drinking and gambling on Saturday night in the local saloon, and then was hungover, mumbling through the ceremony Sunday morning. And then people actually wrote letters to church officials back in England to be like, look, you got to send somebody else. So the church, not that important in Virginia for quite a while. Massachusetts is a very different situation. All right, so the first group that comes over, we usually call the Pilgrims in 1620. They didn't leave from England, though. They left from the Netherlands. They had left England years before in search of religious freedom because they were more strict than the Church of England. They thought the Church of England was still too Catholic. They didn't like things like vestments. They didn't like all the holidays and the honoring of the saints. They wanted to worship in a more, what they saw as a more pure New Testament kind of fashion, a more Calvinistic faith and religion. The church isn't just open to anybody. The church should be composed of the elect. So they moved out of England where they were persecuted for having their own worship services because there's a state church, and if you're a dissenter, that's not allowed. And they ended up in the Netherlands, and then they realized, wait a minute, our children, like, yes, there's religious freedom in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is very profit-driven at that time. It's an increasingly kind of secularized society. And they went, what about our kids? Our kids are going to grow up here, and they're not going to care about church. They're going to care about video games, and right? They're just going to care about making money. Like, where can we go that we will be free to worship how we want, but we don't have to worry about our kids being seduced by consumerism? Virginia! That's where we can go because there's nothing there. So they got permission to move to Virginia. Only their ship was blown off course by a storm. They landed in what's now part of Massachusetts. And they're like, we're not going back down to Virginia. We're just going to stay here. And they did. Very small, only a few thousand ever there in the Plymouth Plantations colony. 10 years later, there would be a new wave of similar people. We typically call them the Puritans. So they arrived in 1630. They officially established the Massachusetts Bay Company. And so the second quote that's down that starts at the bottom and then continues over a little bit onto the back page is from John Winthrop, one of the first governors of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was not a minister himself. He was a lawyer. But he delivered a sermon on the Mayflower. Not on the Mayflower, sorry. Their boat was the Godspeed. Called A Model of Christian Charity. And it kind of set out what their plan and purpose was. And so down at the bottom of that first page, he says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." They had a particular view of what the church should look like and what society should look like. They saw themselves as this example to the world. They've been trying to push the Church of England, same kind of ways that the Pilgrims were trying to push, right? That it's still too Catholic. We've got to get rid of these Catholic elements and become a purer, more New Testament-like church. But they couldn't get anywhere in England. So they thought, we'll come to Massachusetts. We'll establish a new colony where we are free to create a church and society the way the Bible says they should be. And then everyone back in England will go, oh, of course. Yeah, that's it. And later on, Winthrop seems to suggest that we can come home then. That this is just a temporary errand in the wilderness, he calls it. When you go on an errand, you don't stay. You go, you do the errand, you come back. So they're going to go, they're going to create the true church, true society, and then they're going to be able to come back. All right, so if you are trying to create a true church, how do you feel about other religious groups?
Not so good.
Not so good, yeah. So when some Quaker missionaries arrive in the 1640s, they say, you got to leave. And they kick them out. When they returned, they put them to death. Roger Williams, Puritan minister, in many ways seemed to be like the ideal Puritan minister. But became really worried if church, the people who gather together for worship and who take communion together, if that's only supposed to be the elect, right, those who are predestined by God to go to heaven, you can only take communion with those people. And if you take communion with someone who's going to hell, you also are condemned and will be punished by God. How do you be a minister of a congregation when you can't be sure your people are elect? So he stopped having communion with his congregation. The other people complained, right? And it became a whole thing. He's sort of put on trial. He's encouraged to leave. And he went off and founded the colony of Rhode Island, the city of Providence. Rhode Island became the first colony not to have an established church. It's really weird. If you think about that, Roger Wood, this is a guy who won't take communion with his wife because he's not sure she's going to heaven. But he believes in religious toleration. Doesn't matter what faith you want to worship, you're all going to hell anyway. So we're just going to have a civil society where we are kind and polite to one another and we behave ourselves. And so Rhode Island is the first to not. And so it's kind of a weird position that Williams takes. But a lot of people in Massachusetts were thankful to see him go. Anne Hutchinson started, now it was very common, Puritan church services, long. They were long, hours. Usually the communion prayer lasted an hour. Just a prayer. So you'd have an hour of singing psalms, you'd have an hour of prayer, you'd have an hour or two of the sermon, so you were there all morning. That usually wasn't enough church, though, for people. So when it was done, they would often go to other people's homes who would offer thoughts on the sermon. And Hutchinson is one of those people. Originally just for women, start coming to hear her thoughts on the sermon of the day from the minister there in town. But eventually men started showing up also. And so that would eventually cause problems, especially when she criticized other ministers in Massachusetts for not being Calvinistic enough. How do you know that you're one of the elect? Oh, I'm sorry. It's a terrible thing to ask a group of non-Calvinists. Right? Okay, so there's no, easy answer, even for the Puritans. But they tried to come up with one. They thought, okay, do you like going to church? If you're going and sitting through 4 hours, do you like it? Because if you do like it, that's probably a sign you're not going to hell. Right? Someone that was not one of the elect would probably not like church, would probably hate to read Scripture, would probably hate to pray. So if you enjoyed those things, if you found meaning in those things, many Puritan ministers argue that's probably a roundabout way to realize you're one of the elect. Because someone going to hell would not have the Holy Spirit, and it's the Holy Spirit that allows us to enjoy those things and find meaning in those things. And Hutchinson said, all of that stuff, that's works righteousness. You are trusting in actions instead of relying upon the sovereignty and grace of God. Okay, so that was just like dropping a theological atom bomb in the whole society. Plus, she's a woman. That caused all kinds of other problems. So they put her on trial. She was isolated in jail for days. She's interrogated by just waves of Puritan ministers and lawyers like John Winthrop. My favorite is she's accused of teaching men, which Paul clearly says, right? A woman's not supposed to teach in church. You're teaching men. How dare you do that? And she flips the table on them brilliantly. She says, yeah, but I'm a woman. They're coming to my house. I can't kick them out because I'm a woman. It's not my fault they're coming and listening. I'm only a woman. I don't have the authority to tell them no. It's their fault. They should be on trial. But eventually she makes a mistake. They're finally like, where did you get this idea that this is works righteousness? And she says, Jesus told me. Personal relationships, personal conversations with Jesus? No, that's not allowed. So she is kicked out. She ends up in Rhode Island with her family. She's married, has kids. We have no sense of what her husband thought about any of this. Eventually, sadly, they are killed in an Indian attack. But John Winthrop celebrates it. That's what happens to God's enemies. Okay, now I'd like to emphasize all of this because one of the other things that I've heard growing up, right, is that why did people come to the United States? Religious freedom. Sort of true, right? But just remember, it's religious freedom for them, right? Especially here in New England, because it doesn't just become Massachusetts, it becomes Connecticut, it becomes New Hampshire. Eventually, Maine will separate out and become its own state, right? This whole area is dominated by the Puritan churches that come to be called congregational churches, because every congregation was independent. Theologically, very Calvinist in their leaning. So they believe in religious freedom for themselves, but this is their original errand, to create the true church. You can't really tolerate others then, because God himself will punish you, is what Winter says. Two other areas I want to kind of like briefly mention. Maryland, in the 1830s, was founded as a haven for Roman Catholics. It didn't stay that way for long. There just weren't enough Roman Catholics, English Roman Catholics, willing to move to Maryland. Maryland wasn't too much better than Virginia. The only thing that helped Maryland is it's still in the Chesapeake region, right? So they're able to grow tobacco also. So the people coming to settle in Maryland already knew we can grow tobacco and make money. But it's still a struggle. And eventually the Church of England becomes the dominant church in Maryland, but originally founded for Roman Catholics. And then New Jersey and Pennsylvania, founded, both of those colonies founded by the Penn family. The Penn family were Quakers. And so there were a bunch of Quakers that moved to New Jersey, but then especially to Pennsylvania, which was specifically founded to be a refuge for Quakers. Also being persecuted back in England, but could move to Pennsylvania and get a farm and escape persecution. The original Rhode Island under Roger Williams and Pennsylvania under the Penn family were the only two English colonies that dealt equitably with the local Native Americans. Roger Williams paid money and arranged a treaty with the Narragansett Indians, and then the Penns did the same kind of thing with the tribe. The name is, I've lost it. There in Pennsylvania. And as long as William Penn was governor for a few decades, there were no wars between Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania, and the local Indian nations, which is not the case with every other colony. Right, so at least that's something. But we get a pattern that emerges. In the New England area, you have congregational churches that are dominant. In the southern part, Virginia, Maryland, the two Carolinas, eventually Georgia, the last to be founded in the 1730s. The Church of England is going to be the established church. And then in the middle colonies of New York and Pennsylvania, the Church of England is official in New York, and the Quakers are official in Pennsylvania, but there's a bit more diversity and different groups allowed. Wow, that's all number one. All right, so look at a few maps. So here we've got, and maybe it would have been helpful to have looked at those, Virginia. You can see by 1700, there's still not a lot of land that is dominated and controlled by English settlers. Right, the dotted line is the fall line. Everything to the east of that line flows into the Atlantic Ocean, river-wise eventually. Everything west of that line eventually flows into the Mississippi. So there's no English settlements basically beyond the fall line because getting your crops to market is essential. Massachusetts is one of the most churched places in the world at this time. It's because whole families moved. The first thing they did when they established a new town was they built a church and had a minister as a part of it. So there are more ministers per square mile in Massachusetts than anywhere else in the English-speaking world in the 16 and 1700s. And it's just part of this plan for settlement. So by the 1700s, this is generally what the colonies look like, with the colors on the map showing about the extent of European settlement. There are still, though, Native Americans living in all of those shaded areas. It's just now the majority of the population would be descendants of European settlers. But still, look, right, like Virginia, it's close to being the size it'll eventually become, but it's not the full state. Right? Georgia is almost nothing compared to what it's going to become state-wise, right, as far as settlement goes. Ethnically, thanks to the growing rise in the institution of slavery, there are places in the South where the dominant population are slaves, directly imported against their will from Africa. But you could see also all the different colors then of the different ethnic groups that have arrived by the 1700s, by 1750. So then in the 1720s, we get something known as the First Great Awakening. And in the Americas, it's because of this fun name, Theodore Frelinghuysen. He is a pietist, a Presbyterian, a Reformed pietist. Now, the pietist movement in the continental Europe said we are more than just brains on a stick. We have emotions, we have hearts and feelings and desires, and that's okay because that's how God made us. So faith needs to be more than just an intellectual response to Jesus. This is good news that Jesus proclaimed. We should feel good about the good news. That implies a different style of preaching. Instead of just standing in front and preaching and reading from your notes for 2 hours, there needs to be an emotional appeal to the audience. Telling of stories, the telling of anecdotes. You preach without notes, maybe? You make eye contact with people, make them feel guilty or nervous. Why are they looking at me when they're talking about hell? You make that kind of connection. Right? Because we're not just brains on a stick. So Frelinghuysen came to the colonies and began teaching the idea that ministers should be trained in piety and not just rationalism. Well, that influenced the Tennant family. The father established the log cabin college, which would become part of Princeton University, century later, just to train ministers in piety. And his son Gilbert became a traveling minister. So this was something different, not a settled congregation. And one of his most famous sermons was called On the Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. So I've given you a quote from him on the back. That's the one. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to just summarize part of it. He basically says, are you bored in church? Do you get nothing from the sermon? It's probably because your minister's going to hell. Why would you expect to get anything from a minister who is not converted himself? Then he also floated the idea that, look, if you're not getting anything from this church, it's probably because they're not a true believer and Christian anyway. You should be free to go somewhere else to find salvation. Right? It should be illegal to force someone to go to church if that minister is not a Christian himself. Isn't it convenient that he's one that's going around going, hey, like my sermons better? I'm living in misery. Now, Tennant was at least a little bit tactful when challenged by a minister, how dare you say, I'm not converted? Oh, I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about these others. Obviously, you're saved. He left it vague with a sermon about who might or might not be, and kind of left that. There was another minister named Davenport who named names. He would arrive in town and be like, yeah, your minister, Charlie, definitely going to hell. So not super popular when they would roll into town. Jonathan Edwards, a minister in New England, began praying for revival. He looked around at his congregation. He's like, there's a lot of young adults here who don't appear to take their faith seriously. And so he prayed that there would be an emotional outbreak of the Spirit in his congregation. And there was. And partially it's tied to this more emotional preaching that he began doing. His famous, does anyone know the name of his famous sermon? What?
Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
That's it. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. The image that he put, we are a horrible, gross, disgusting spider. That the hand of God is dangling over a fire. Like we have no hope of salvation. We deserve to be dropped into the fire and destroyed and burned forever. Better ask God not to drop you. Better ask God today not to drop you into the fire. Can you see why some people might respond to that kind of message? It's very powerful. I remember reading that sermon in high school, English class. I was like, holy cow. I mean, like, I grew up in church, but I had never heard sinners in the hand of an angry God sermon like that before. So that was something else. The First Great Awakening produces revivals then, right, all over the American colonies. George Whitefield, an Anglican minister, came and did 7 missionary tours up and down the coast. He was a pioneer of lots of different tactics. Tactics sounds negative, but I don't mean it that way. Things that we do, like advanced advertising. Right, so he might start off in Savannah, Georgia, but he'd be going to Charleston next week. Sorry, Charlestown at that time. He didn't want to show up unannounced, so he'd take out advertisements in the Charlestown newspapers. Whitefield's coming. Mary Jo of Savannah says, best sermon I ever heard. Right? Used testimonies, advertisements. He sold souvenirs to help fund his ministry. Buy a copy of his sermon books. You could buy plates with his face on it, teapots, all to help fund the expenses of his tour. All of that. As I'm saying it, it sounds so tawdry and like cheap. I think we've had too many like televangelists and things, that kind of stuff. It was very revolutionary for the time. He didn't make money, right? He didn't die a millionaire. He did die on his 7th preaching tour. He didn't finish. So like the funds really did go to pay for his expenses. But this is where this stuff kind of comes from. It's from Whitefield. Whitefield is good buddies with someone else that you all should be familiar with. Right, the Wesleys, yeah. Part of the Holy Club at Oxford growing up. So, but everywhere these ministers go, there's often a lot of conflict. Partially because it's people like Tennant showing up and saying, maybe your minister isn't converted, and that's what the problem is. They're preaching outside, like Whitefield is. Benjamin Franklin, right, printer in Philadelphia, famous for his Poor Richard's Almanac and all of his advice. A penny saved is, right? So you don't just spend things willy-nilly. Franklin tells the story of going to hear Whitefield preach for the first time in Philadelphia. And he'd heard the reports of the large crowds that come, thousands of people. Franklin said, there's no way. You can't preach to that many people in here. So when Whitefield showed up downtown, Franklin said, I went to see what was going on, and I paced around the square and took notice of the crowd, and he knew how many people could fit there, and he's like, okay, so that's not an exaggeration. He's preaching to 10,000 people, all right. And then he says he got so caught up in the sermon that when the offering plate was passed, he reached in, pulled out all the change that he had in his pockets, and put it in the offering plate. If that's not a testimony, golden testimony, right? Franklin, everyone knew his reputation. He's like, now he doesn't say how much change was in his pocket. He's also a printer of newspapers. Whitefield sells newspapers. Right? So Franklin may have had some other motivations for telling this kind of story, but it's big news. It's a big deal. Lots of conflicts and fights between settled churches and these traveling ministers. Some congregations just came to accept what came to be called the New Lights, Those that supported these revivals supported the more enthusiastic preaching, and others, the old lights, the frozen chosen, the ones that just in these settled congregations. But one of the things then that was revealed in this First Great Awakening is Gilbert Tennant was never struck by lightning for preaching against an established church. If you could rebel against the established church, maybe that also means you can rebel against an established government. Right? So there's some connection. It's not like a direct connection between the First Great Awakening and the American Revolution. But the established churches were just such a given. Right? This is part of the God-ordained universe to have an established church. And if nothing happened with these new lights, and there's just new congregations, and it's all okay, then maybe it's okay to rebel against other things that we'd assumed were ordained by God and set in stone for all of time, like king and parliament. So, okay, well that's point 2. So I've got like 5 minutes and then questions, is that right?
Probably take questions.
Just take questions. Woo!
You got, I know the choir people have left and other people need to leave, so yeah.
Okay.
This is great.
Let me just say something real quick about the revolution. Bad time for ministers. Think of all those English Anglican ministers in the South, like Virginia Church of England. All the big people, right, you probably think of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. They're all in Virginia. The Church of England is not pro-revolution. Right? The Church of England almost universally is, this is bad. Don't rebel against the king and country. Which means, are you going to go to a church service where the minister is, revolution is bad? If you're one of these Virginia patriots, no. Church attendance drops throughout the revolution. It's a really kind of struggling time with all of that. Okay. Questions. What questions? I'll come back and talk about the Constitution next week and move us into the Second Great Awakening with the revivals, that fun stuff, barking like dogs and climbing up trees and passing out. Great stuff. Yes?
Books to read.
Books to read. A general survey of like all of religion. There's one by John Butler, Grant Wacker, and Randall Balmer. It's called Religion in American Life, A Short History. 445 pages. Really good. They are 3 experts in the field in different time periods, and I think very readable. I've used this in my Religion in America class. So I would recommend that if you're just thinking about something that talks about all of American religious history. Other questions? Yes?
This might be a little off topic, but you mentioned King James I, I think. Did any of this going on in the colonies impact the political, like the Civil War over in England? I might have my chronology.
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry, yes. The question was if anything going on here in the colonies had any effect on, or the colonies have any effect on the English Civil War or things going on back in England.
Yes, sir.
No. Much to the embarrassment of Massachusetts. Right, so Massachusetts Bay Colony founded 1630. John Winthrop, we're going to be the city on a hill. We're on this errand. Then in the 1640s, the English Civil War breaks out. Eventually, King Charles I loses, is beheaded. There is no English king. It's the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. Monty Python sang a great song about Oliver Cromwell, the protector of England. And so for a couple decades, Parliament is in charge. The Church of England is more Presbyterian because of it, theologically. And everyone back in Massachusetts goes, this is the moment we've been waiting for. Like, we have done all of the prep work. They wrote a big book to say, like, all right, the king's dead. Here's how you can fix everything and become the true church. And everybody back in England went, hey, we can't hear you across the ocean. So it's kind of in that moment, in the 1650s and 60s, and then when Charles I's son, Charles, was invited back, and we have the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, that Massachusetts went, okay, I guess we're here permanently. Like that was a window that they thought, we'll get to influence things, and they're just totally ignored. A little, no little. There are lots of wars, especially as the French colonies grow. So whenever England and France are fighting each other, or England and Spain are fighting each other, which is almost all the time, there's fighting in the colonies. One of the biggest and most famous we know of as the French and Indian War, started by George Washington. He literally started that war, but it got carried over into Europe as well. So sometimes there are things that happen like that with wars, but we'll go over here.
You touched on the founding of Princeton. If it's not too long, could you comment on the founding of Harvard and Yale?
Yeah, in very short fashion, that was one of the brilliancies of the Puritans of Massachusetts. They believed in a highly educated ministry. And so it didn't make sense to try to send people back across to England. We'll create a university here. So very early on, Harvard was established to train ministers. Decades later, there was a fear that it was a bit too liberal, starting to teach other things, not really training people for the ministry. So let's create a new university that will be dedicated to training ministers. And you get Yale. That was very short.
All right. I'm sure, are there